Britain's trade presence in Africa has weakened, and weakened quite a lot over the last 20 or 30 years. At one point, about 7% of their trade was with Africa, and it slipped to about 2% in the last 3 decades or so. UK Prime Minister Theresa May was here in August. She came on a sub-Saharan Africa tour, looking to improve Britain's declining share of the continent's trade. I'm Bruce Whitfield. This is Taking Stock, and we're looking at the United Kingdom trade with Africa with the UK Trade Commissioner for Africa, Emma Wade-Smith. Is this because you're losing your best friends in Europe? You've decided, as the British public, that you don't want to be BFFs with Europe anymore, and you need new friends, that you are now looking to do more trade with us?
Well, I think we've seen trade flows change quite dramatically all across the world over the last 20 to 30 years. And I think it can be sometimes a little bit misleading to think about market share. What we like to look at actually is the value of that trade and investment relationship. That's the big focus for me across Africa. When we look at trade flows across the world, we're seeing that over the next decade, over the next 20 years, actually about 90% of the world's global trade will be growing outside of the European Union rather than in it. And so we think that actually being a global trading partner is the right thing for the UK.
But as a proportion of trade, in the last 20 years, China's become a big trading nation, for example, has become a dominant player. The Turks are big in Africa. Lots of Middle Eastern players are coming into this continent. Historical colonial links mean different countries have got different relationships with others. Why has the UK allowed its, I know you don't like the term market share, but its market share to slip?
Well, I think what I would say is the UK has over £30 billion of trading relationship with Africa. That's not a bad place to be. It's my role to think about how do we build the value of that and encourage more trade in both directions, actually, between the UK and Africa. And of course, the world is changing, and part of this is actually how do you identify where trade has come from. So the classic story is about an iPhone, and how much of that is American, how much of that is Chinese, and how do you track that through the global supply chain. And I think what we're seeing, certainly what I'm seeing as the Trade Commissioner for Africa, is a dramatic increase in the amount of interest from the UK business community to come and do business in Africa and with Africans. And that's really exciting to see.
We'll talk about that in just a moment. I need to understand, and I think many people watching this need to understand, this Brexit phenomenon. The former UK Prime Minister David Cameron was in South Africa last week. He hasn't made many public appearances since he stepped down in 2016, making way for the current Prime Minister Theresa May, after David Cameron agreed that the British public should have a referendum on whether or not to stay part of the European Union. When 52-48 in favour of leaving the European Union, and there's a very tight and increasingly tight deadline for Britain to meet various requirements in terms of it to make a clean exit from the European Union on the 31st of March next year. In simple terms, if you can, I know this is the world's most complicated thing, but explain this Brexit concept in layman's terms to us.
Gosh, that's quite a challenge, Bruce. Thank you for that. The simple matter is that the UK has decided to leave the European Union, and we're negotiating what that new relationship is going to look like. We believe that we've got quite a long way down that negotiation in terms of, both in terms of the trade relationship as well as the movement of people, goods, services, the way that our national security systems have been integrated over the last years. All of that needs to be looked at, and actually the negotiations have proceeded at pace and have made some real progress on that.
I mean, and again, this is not something, a sphere that you can delve into, but the politics of this is very, very messy. It's causing big divides within the United Kingdom. It's calls for new referenda. We've seen Tony Blair, former Prime Minister, say that it's perfectly legal and perfectly legitimate for another referendum to be called, just to be absolutely certain that this is the right path to take. Would it be an appropriate mechanism, considering that before Brexit people were so bored with the idea that, and didn't really appreciate the mechanism and didn't appreciate the complexity of it, simply it was quite an emotional response to various political promises from different sides of the political divides in the UK. Is it time to have another vote on this to make sure, absolutely sure, that it's the right thing to do?
Well, look, the UK government has been very clear, and the Prime Minister has been very clear on repeated occasions that she doesn't intend for there to be a second referendum on this issue. The people voted and they have made their decision, and the government is working to deliver that decision for the UK.
David Cameron last week did seem quite resigned to that. I mean, he said, I wish that people had voted differently, but I gave them a democratic right. We promised we would do it. We did it, and they voted, and it was close, and I wish they hadn't voted that way, but that is, we made our bet, now we have to lie in it, effectively.
Yeah, I think what we saw was a fairly large emotional reaction to the referendum result, and what I've seen over the last couple of years is an adaptation to the new reality. This is going to happen. The UK will leave the European Union at the end of March 2019, and individuals, families, businesses are adapting to that new reality.
I mean, there's a lot of paranoia around this. There's stories of sort of almost like mercy ships of key medicines and food supplies, a bit like South Africa was in 1994, where some people stockpiled baked beans and water and candles and things because they had no idea what it would look like after the 27th of April 1994, and there was some level of panic. There's some level of panic in Britain right now as to whether or not the borders are going to freeze, the queues are going to form, and it's going to be an unholy mess. Or is it going to be more Y2K, where it happens and people go, oh, that was it, okay, and then carry on? What are you anticipating as the British Civil Service is going to be the eventuality on the 1st of April, which is a terrible day to do anything dramatic anywhere in the world?
So one of the wonderful things about the United Kingdom is that we have a very free and very vibrant media, and and it's absolutely within their remit to think about all the different aspects of Brexit. This is the biggest decision that has sort of faced the United Kingdom since we voted to join the European Union 40 plus
but you
years
didn't
ago.
join the European Union. That's the point. No, but this is the political point, which is you joined the European Community, which is a fundamentally different offering to what has morphed into a Brussels-centred, bureaucratic sort of set of constraints that more British people hated than liked. I mean, that's the reality. This thing has changed, and times have changed, and it's 55 years later. Is this the right thing? Well,
I think that was one of the reasons why David Cameron called the referendum in the first place, because there was this growing recognition that over a number of different treaties, the rules of the game had changed dramatically from 40 years ago, and he felt very strongly that the British people needed to be able to have a voice, to be heard about that. And to your earlier point about the emotion, the way that emotion drove voting, I think there was definitely an aspect of that, and the campaign was very vibrantly fought on both sides. But actually, what many political leaders and others have dissected since the vote was actually that there was some real basis of fact and reality for many people about their experience of the world, not just in the UK, but actually feeling sort of left behind, feeling that these dramatic improvements in lifestyle that we've seen over the last decades had passed them by to some extent, and feeling that actually they needed and wanted to see a change.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that change in just a moment. More on this conversation after the break. Theresa May has said that Britain wants to be the G7's largest contributor to trade with Africa by the year 2022. That doesn't give Emma much time to facilitate that. We'll talk about that and other issues coming up on Taking Stock here on ENCA.